Back again to talk about my first read for BookTrek 2023, The Summer of Trek, Bloodthirst by J.M. Dillard. I chose this book for a specific reason. I spent April and May on a personal reading project that I called Vampire and Maypire, where I read as many as my vampire novels as I could get through in that 2-month period. And this book is centered around a virus that gives the infected vampire-like symptoms. So I thought this would be an excellent segue into BookTrek, and I was right. I loved this book, which really surprised me because I was expecting it to be silly. I was expecting it to be one of the more ridiculous Star Trek books, and it actually wasn't. It was actually very, very good and a really well-told story, I thought, and all the characters were interesting. Spock, McCoy, and Kirk, and all of the bridge crew, they're all in character. I could very easily hear their voices in my head saying the dialogue in this book. There was also an Andorian character in this book, and I absolutely love the Andorians. They're my favorite Star Trek race. We just did not get enough Andorians in any of the Star Trek shows. I think the most Andorian we got was in Enterprise, but even that wasn't enough to fulfill my desire to learn about the Andorians. And so this book actually fills in a little bit of the holes for the Andorians, even though it's not canon, of course. But in this book, the Andorians actually suffered from a plague where it rendered the majority of their population sterile. And so for a few generations, most of the population was unable to have children. And so it became the part of their culture or their social standard, I guess, for the females to stay at home and have children and help perpetuate the race. And if you didn't do that, you were looked down upon and even disowned. And even though they have since cured this plague and they're reproducing just fine now, they still hung on to this idea that the women should stay at home and have children. And our little Andorian is one of the security officers, or security ensign, I guess. And her family has disowned her for leaving home and joining Star Trek, Starfleet to pursue a life of her own. And that was just one of the little side stories that I really, really enjoyed. And I enjoyed the whole, like I said, I love the Andorians. So I loved having a few holes filled in on their culture. We had another character whose name I've forgotten now, but he was a character who had been a lieutenant. And he had a girlfriend who was smuggling weapons, and she planted one of the weapons on him, hoping that he would be able to get it through a security check for her, but instead he got caught with it. And he never turned her in, he just took the blame. And so he was busted down to an ensign. So he is the little Andorian girl's co-worker, and they end up having a romance. Now, normally I don't like romance in my Star Trek. It really annoys me usually, but it actually really worked in this one. I really enjoyed it. They didn't spend a lot of time on the romance aspect. What they spent more time on was the tension it caused in their working environment, and I thought that was great. I thought it was just a wonderful addition to the story being told. There's also a like the security chief, the second in command for the security chief, whatever her rank was, I don't recall, but she was a really interesting character as well. She actually had a boyfriend who had asked her to marry him. And I'm putting him in quotes because in this book, you don't marry somebody for life. What you do is you enter into a marriage contract. So you are married to somebody for X amount of years, however long the contract lasts. And at the end of the contract, you can choose to renew that or to not renew that and move on. And so she is asked by this man to enter into a marriage contract, but it's not just a marriage contract with him. It's a group marriage contract. So in this book, it's not it's not just two people in a relationship. There can also be multiple people in a relationship. So she's been asked to join this marriage group, and has this whole process of indecision about whether or not she wants to do that in this book. And that seems really silly, but again, it's just one of these things that really worked in the context rather of this book, because it created some additional tension during their situation on the Enterprise. So this whole book starts with the Enterprise receiving a distress call. They go to answer this distress call, and they find a dead man and a dead woman, and they find a third person who was alive, but he's extremely sick. And as it turns out, he's been infected with an engineered virus that causes vampire-like symptoms. Now, not super strength or any of the ridiculous stuff, but a severe form of anemia, and a sensitivity to light. So he cannot be in light at all. It causes him an intense amount of pain, so they have to quarantine him in sick bay in a pitch black room. He also craves blood to the point that he is willing to kill people in order to get that blood, which he is able to control and hide for quite some time before the Enterprise crew figures that out. We also have an Admiral Mendez, who is the brother of Commodore Mendez, I forgot his first name, from the episode The Menagerie. So I thought that was a nice little nod to a TOS episode, that it's his brother. But where the Mendez in The Menagerie was a nice guy, the Mendez in this book is a villain. And, you know, it's against the law in Starfleet to engineer biological weapons, but he was part of this whole, engineering biological weapon plot. And so he's a bad guy. So he's trying to cover his tracks and get his hands on Adams, which is the infected man they found down on the planet. And Adams doesn't want to go back to Mendez because he feels that Mendez is going to kill him. And so he's flipping out. But Adams is also not a good guy. He wasn't a good guy to start with. And then plus the illness has made him, kind of crazy as well. And it was just a whole involved ordeal. And I loved every single minute of it. It was so good. Just absolutely loved it. So one of my favorite parts of this book, and this is a spoiler, so at this point you'll want to turn off the video if you don't want anything important in the book spoiled. So in this book, Nurse Chapel gets infected with this virus. Adams infects her. He attacks her in an escape attempt, and she becomes infected. And she gets to a point where she is going to die. She's on life support, and that's the only thing that's keeping her alive. And there was this whole touching scene in here with McCoy and Spock when they are going to pull the plug on Christine Chapel. And it was really, really touching. And so I'm going to read that little section out. So in this scene, McCoy is about to pull the plug on Christine, and Spock enters the room to get some information from him. And McCoy looks up, and at first he's angry that Spock has interrupted him at such a delicate moment, because he and Nurse Chapel are extremely, extremely close friends, and McCoy is absolutely devastated. So Spock turns to leave, but McCoy stops him. "Wait," McCoy said raggedly. His fear at being interrupted had suddenly vanished. He felt he could not bear what he had to do alone. A glimmer of surprise crossed Spock's face, tilting one eyebrow upward. "My question can certainly wait, Doctor." He glanced pointedly at Christine. "Spock," McCoy stepped hopefully toward the glass, hanging on to Spock's presence as if it were a lifeline offering escape from the encroaching blackness. "Spock, you knew how Christine felt about you?" He let the intonation rise to a question. He would not betray Chris's trust by letting on she had told him about the PSI 2000 incident. "Yes," Spock answered, composed but guarded. There was no point in explaining to Spock what was going on here. He had already indicated that he had seen and understood. "You're immune," McCoy told him. I got your test results today. The virus doesn't care for Vulcan blood." He paused. "Would you come inside? Just stay for a minute while I do this." The back of his throat tightened painfully. He had to swallow hard to keep the tears from coming. Chris would have liked that. Spock looked intently at him for a moment, and then he said, "Certainly, Dr. McCoy. Nurse Chapel has done the same for me on more than one occasion." McCoy coated the doors open, glad that the second's pause while Spock entered the chamber gave him a chance to wipe his streaming eyes. Damn that Vulcan. McCoy would have been able to keep from weeping if Spock had typically said something aggravatingly logical. Spock entered the chamber and stood next to the doctor in an elegant posture of restraint, hands clasped behind his back. With surprise at his own steadiness, McCoy removed the connections that kept Christine's heart beating. Chris's heart should have kept on pumping for a while, but instead it gave 3 irregular beats and then stopped altogether, as if it had no will to continue on its own. The clinical part of McCoy's mind made note of this as odd, but for now the agony of what he had to do kept him from mentioning it to Spock. He turned off the respirator. Chris's lungs caught a final breath and deflated with a gentle sigh. Her chest did not rise again. Together, Spock and McCoy watched the monitor as each of her life signs stabilized at 0. Very, very touching. I actually got a little sniffly when I was reading that passage. So yes, I would definitely recommend this. I thought it was excellent. And if you are participating in BookTrek, BookTrek rather, this is definitely one you should pick up.